Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's talk on policy, inequality, and motherhood, which is part of our Power of Arts and Sciences Week. The teaching and scholarship within arts and sciences impacts lives far beyond our campus. This series is a celebration of that impact, and I'm so pleased that you have joined us today. I am Deanna Barch, Chair and Professor of Psychological and Brain Sciences and Professor of Psychiatry and Radiology. And I have the privilege today of moderating the discussion and introducing our wonderful speakers. This year, many Power of Arts and Sciences events were inspired by our new strategic plan, which was made public just this past Monday. I had the honor of serving as the steering committee co-chair in the development of the strategic plan, which defines a really exciting shared vision for the next 10 years in arts and sciences. I hope that each of you will take a moment to look through it. I'm sure you will be inspired by our vision for the years ahead. One of the priorities named in our strategic plan is connecting the work that we do and the discoveries we make with our community and society. Today's event is really a perfect example of this. Two of our finest scholars are studying how policy decisions are impacting a crucial aspect of our society, motherhood. Research on gender inequality in the work. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing these two wonderful speakers. First is Dr. Caitlyn Collins, who is an assistant professor in sociology. She conducts cross-national qualitative research on gender inequality in the workplace and family life, and she is broadly interested in the relationship between policy, culture, and social inequality. Her current project is an interview study of 135 working mothers in Sweden, Germany, Italy, and the United States. And these are really interesting comparison countries because they offer distinct policy approaches. And Dr. Collins examines how different ideals of gender and motherhood and employment are embedded in these policies and how they shape the daily lives of working mothers in each country. A book based on this research called Making Motherhood Work: How Women Manage Careers in Caregiving was published in February of 2019. In addition, we have Dr. Zakiya Luna, who is an associate professor of sociology and a Dean's Distinguished Professional Scholar. Her research centers upon the overlapping areas of social change, sociology of law, health, and inequality. More specifically, she's interested in social movements, human rights, and reproduction, with an emphasis on the effects of intersecting inequalities within and across these sites. She is author of the recently published Reproductive Rights as Human Rights, Women of Color, and the Fight for Reproductive Justice. And now, at the end of this talk, we will return and I will moderate a Q&A. So feel free as we go along to submit your questions in the Q&A box throughout the event. And now, without further ado, I have the great pleasure of turning it over to Dr. Collins and Dr. Luna for their wonderful presentations.
Thank you so much, Deanna, for that lovely introduction. And thank you also to the college for the kind invitation to join you all today, share a little bit about my research, and also engage in a very welcome chat with my new colleague, Zakiya Luna. We're both in our offices in the sociology departments. So we're close by geographically, but it's nice to engage in this virtual talk. And thanks to you all for being here in the audience today. I'm going to take a few minutes to tell you a little bit more about my research and then turn it over to Zakiya to tell you a bit about what she does before we engage in this chat with Deanna. So as you just heard in the introduction, my specialty is in the area of gender inequality in the workplace and in family life. And the vast majority of my work in the past, decade or so has focused on the question of how working mothers in different countries navigate employment and motherhood, given the very different public policies and cultural attitudes in these various places about gender and work and family. And I'm often asked by my students and others why I got interested in this in the first place. And the truth is that I grew up with a working mother who had a really hard time navigating both employment and motherhood for herself. And after spending time abroad after graduating undergrad, it became really obvious to me that the struggles that my own mother faced and who was very advantaged in the context of other US mothers given how difficult her experiences were, it was interesting to see mothers elsewhere navigating work and family very differently than my own mom did. And this spurred an interest in how these country contexts can shape the experiences of motherhood. And my sense from a young age with my own mom was that it just really didn't seem fair that someone like her, who had a very fulfilling job that she loved, ended up quitting this job that that she identified strongly with and was really good at, to stay home primarily with my mom, with my little sister and me. Once my folks got divorced, that felt kind of like an injustice to me from a young age. And within the study of sociology, when I embarked on this in grad school, pursuing this kind of cross-national interest in how mothers navigate employment and motherhood in different countries became the focus of my research. And I have my book I can show you, Making Motherhood Work, that Deanna kindly mentioned, which came out a couple of years ago. So I spent 5 years conducting interviews in, as she mentioned, Sweden and Germany, Italy, and the United States to get a sense for what working mothers' daily lives are like on the ground. We have a lot of research that shows that public policies have a big influence on how moms navigate these daily decisions, but there hadn't actually been a project that turned to moms themselves to amplify their voices about what they feel they need in their day-to-day lives and what they think could be improved to support them better. And very unfortunately, in comparing these four country contexts, what became clear was that American mothers stood apart from those in these other countries for their stress, their overwhelm, their guilt, their exhaustion. And they were also unique in blaming themselves for their difficulties rather than external sources. So in these European countries, moms in Italy, for example, blame the government for their work-family conflict, thinking they deserve to be supported better. And in both Germany and Sweden, working mothers blamed in Germany outdated cultural ideals about moms' primary responsibility being the domestic sphere and caregiving. And in Sweden, they blamed what they called sort of unreasonably high expectations for parents about kind of giving your all to your children as the main source of their work-family conflict. But it was American moms, again, who stood apart and thinking it was their own fault that they were so guilty and stressed and overwhelmed. And to me, this is really sad, but it also isn't surprising because the United States has the most family hostile public policy of any country in the industrialized world, with no federal paid parental leave, no federal paid maternity or paternity leave, no universal health care, no universal child care, no universal social insurance entitlement, no federal minimum standard for paid vacation and sick days. The US government takes a very privatized approach for thinking about families, thinking that if you have children, it's your responsibility on your own to figure out how to raise them. And so moms blaming themselves and adopting very individual solutions to their stresses makes a lot of sense in this context. But the findings from my research suggest that indeed we do need more robust and progressive work-family policies like we see as the norm in much of the Western industrialized world, as well as some very real cultural changes about who we think can and should care for children. And at the same time, in the workplace, we need to find ways to allow folks to combine employment and caregiving in a way that allows them to have contented and fulfilling lives in both spheres of life. So those are some main takeaways from the book. And more recently, in the context of the pandemic, as we know, parents across the board have been struggling before the pandemic even happened to navigate employment and motherhood in this kind of family hostile public policy context. It is women who have been bearing the disproportionate responsibility for caregiving, given kind of gendered ideals here in the United States. And so as the pandemic kind of hit in a big way last March of 2020, there was a lot of talk about whether perhaps one silver lining of this very difficult time, especially for more advantaged parents who were able to work from home as the pandemic unfolded, maybe this unprecedented experience might allow fathers to see how much work it goes into managing the domestic sphere, and what we might see as this sort of equalization in the amount of work that both moms and dads do in households to manage work and family life, right? And if that's the case, as some folks argued, we would see perhaps reductions in both men's and women's work hours as schools and daycares across the country closed, all of that caregiving work moved into the home. If this potential silver lining played out in the way that we might hope, we'd see both men and women reduce their working hours. And I embarked on a series of collaborative projects with some colleagues at other universities to measure empirically whether this was actually the case. And unfortunately, it wasn't, right? What we see is really an exacerbation of pre-existing social inequalities by gender, but also by race and by class. So this more recent research on employment, parenting in the pandemic shows that unfortunately it is mothers who have been reducing their work hours and not fathers, especially those with young children. And those who have been hardest hit by the pandemic are unfortunately exactly who we would expect. It is low-income parents, especially low-income mothers, single mothers, and mothers of color who have been hardest hit by employment losses, reductions in working hours as well. And this has really troubling consequences long-term for social inequality, but it also points to public policy solutions targeting particular families who most need support at this difficult time. So those are a few points about what I've been up to in the past few years. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Zakiya to tell you a bit more about her research about motherhood and policy and inequality. Thanks, Zakiya.
Thank you so much, Katie. I love getting this chance to talk with you and hear from the audience. Once again, my name is Zakiya Luna, and I'm faculty in sociology. And I come at this topic from a little bit different approach, because I actually study social movements and movements that are really engaged in thinking broadly about reproductive issues. And how broadly, would you ask? Well, first I want to say Happy International Human Rights Day. And if you didn't know that it was International Human Rights Day globally, in my book, Reproductive Rights as Human Rights, I talk a little more about the sort of context of the US, which my colleague has already given you a sense of it, and how it is that the ways that people understand their sort of rights has been very sort of constrained by the US government, and that has an impact on so many different things, including how we even think of who is a mother. And I have just some brief slides for you. And some of this actually, if you were, for example, to go on Google and do quick image search of mother, what pops up is often images of white middle-class mothers, and we know they're middle class because of, for example, the houses they're standing in front of, or the workplaces they are in. Or if you even go more specifically, working mother as an image, there were a lot of images of folks with laptops. Now, I will say it was much more diverse than when I would do these presentations a few years ago. But there's a particular idea, right, of who a mother is, or what does it mean to be a working mother, right? And that goes to this larger question of like whose mothering is promoted as sort of the norm and which mothers aren't even considered, right, when we're having particular types of policy discussions. And my colleague has already given you some sense of that, but for example, typically in many conversations, right, people, right, when they're talking about working mothers, right, the images that come to mind aren't necessarily, say, the cashiers, right, who are essential workers who didn't have options, for example, to work from home, and were actually busy ensuring that the rest of us, right, could have access to food, but also many folks, right, we know have kids, right? Or fast food workers, for example, right? And these are folks who are in jobs that are even less flexible than many folks that the sort of common Google images points to and don't have many cases, the same types or even really any sort of worker protections, right? And definitely don't, for example, have even basic leaves that are available to them if they get sick or things like this, and they're sort of in high pressure environments to work continually, right? So the folks that are engaged in the movements that I sort of do work around are really interested in this broader understanding of how we think about sort of reproduction broadly, but also the concepts of like who, for example, is mothering and who is involved more broadly in parenting, and why they sort of really focus on this idea of reproductive justice, right? And thinking about, yes, you know, rights to not have children, but also rights to have children and rights to parent children with dignity, right? And to really have the resources to do so and really ask the questions, well, what would it take? And I thank my colleague for talking about, right, the sort of comparative analysis because sometimes people say, well, what could be done? And, we actually do have some examples from other countries where the ideas of parenting and family support is much broader, right? And the sort of understanding that if you support parents broadly, both in the sort of parenthood and also in their workplaces, right, it makes for a much sort of productive set of households, which is better for everybody, right? And in particular, some of the work that has been happening in the reproductive justice movement, which has been around for about 20 years and is women of color led, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian Pacific Islander, but also, there's work that happens in coalition with other spaces, because the idea is that, people are making reproductive decisions and forming families in context, right? They're making decisions about how many resources they have, what healthcare they do or don't have, what kind of access to education they have, just a whole set of things, right? And that the context really matters for people's decisions, but also for their capacity to actually have families that thrive. And some of the work that has been done in the reproductive justice movement has been around moving some of the conversations that are happening even internally within movements for reproductive rights and health to talk about this much more expansive reality for the reproductive spectrum of people's lives, right? And it makes sense when you think about it, right? Because all of us have been part of families in one way or another. We may form our families, and also people have families of choice, right? And of course, people want, their kids to be happy. They want their kids to be healthy. They want our siblings to be healthy. We want our partners, right? And so thinking much more broadly, what does it mean and what does it really take? Well, here are some examples of some of the things that folks in the reproductive justice movement have advocated for. Certainly, they've advocated around some traditional reproductive issues, whether, for example, birth control or abortion, so that people can make decisions about timing of families. But they've also thought more broadly about issues such as the environment, right? Issues that people don't necessarily traditionally associate with reproductive issues. But when you think more about the fact that we raise families in environments, right? And you think about the Flint water crisis, right? What does it mean to try to raise a family when you don't even have clean water to drink, right? Like, what does that really mean in the day-to-day of your life, right? Or what does that mean when the children that you raise, right, you are not sure, for example, if it's in the case of, say, Trayvon Martin, whether or not they'll be able to walk down the street in a family member's neighborhood eating Skittles and experience, police brutality, right? And so the reproductive justice movement really brings together different movement contexts to talk about and think about the reality of many people's lives, particularly folks of color and low-income folks, to say, like, what is it that you really need to, parent your children, for example, without fear, right? What would have to change in the system for that to be the case, right? What would you really need to be able to have, healthy spaces for your children to play, right? Parks, things like that, right? So it's a much broader discussion to think about issues of freedom from violence, much broader discussion to think about issues of environmental justice, right? Or, for example, also to think about issues of leave and paid leave and what does it mean, going back to some of those early images I had, right? That if you are a parent, not just a mother, but a parent, and you are in a workplace that doesn't have a paid leave policy, which we know, obviously federally we don't, and many workplaces don't have a basic paid leave policy, particularly low-income workplaces, right? That you're risking your employment, right? And you're having to make a choice between supporting your family, as in, whether it's taking care of a sick child or supporting your family financially so you can make the rent, right? And, when we're in these sort of, two really bad choices, it's not about bad individuals, right? Making the wrong decision. It's about the system, right? That's set up so that the choices that you have are bad, right? And So reproductive justice advocates have been working for decades, sometimes working with local government, sometimes working at state levels, right, to shift policies, right, and the ways that families are conceptualized so that it includes, right, the full spectrum of families and the different needs that they have. So I look forward to our conversation, and I will stop right there.
All right. Well, thank you both, Dr. Collins and Dr. Luna, for those fabulous talks. So many interesting things that we can follow up on. Let me maybe start by asking you to say something a little bit more broadly, because I think what's really exciting about your presentations today is it illustrates the scholarship that's coming to us from the relatively newly, redeveloped sociology department. And so would love to hear from your perspectives what that's been like for you and what you think that is bringing to WashU, that's kind of a new and novel perspective.
Thanks for that, Deanna. Maybe Zakiya, if it's okay with you, I'll say a few words and turn it over to you. So Deanna, you're exactly right. The sociology department was absent from Washington University for 25 years and was reestablished in 2015, very excitingly. And I think one of the major impetuses that brought the department back to Washington University was the Black Lives Matter movement that started up after the murder of Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, just a few miles up the road from our campus here, right, at the hands of a white police officer. And students at Washington University were asking the campus for classes to help them understand the profound social inequalities that were embedded in this one event, right, that sparked an international movement. And I think the university in part said, this is the job for sociologists. And in fact, there was a void in the sorts of course offerings available for students to understand the roots of what happened to Mike Brown, and also much more broadly to countless others like him in the United States, right? And so very fortunately, Washington University decided to re-inaugurate the department. And I was hired in the second year of the department. Zakiya joined us this year in 2021. We are now a faculty of 12 or so. We have been growing really quickly, and we're a department that specializes in studying both the causes and the consequences of social inequality, in particular with a focus on thinking about how that knowledge can inform positive social change, and with a focus on solutions to social problems. And lots of sociology departments study these things, but this focus on issues of contemporary sort of pressing public concern, and interestingly, a connection to translating our research to more public-facing audiences are central to the department's mission and vision. And part of what makes me so excited to have colleagues like Zakiya and to talk about the overlapping interests that we share is this pride in a department that is really doing things in a kind of an interesting, and I would say sort of novel way compared to other sociology departments across the country. And we have a bit of a selection effect going on here, right? What you have is a brand new department that started hiring from scratch, right? And so what you get is sociologists who have agreed to move to St. Louis and to Washington University from all around the country because they have a deep belief in this mission and vision. And we share a similar idea of what sociology can do to make US society a more fair, just, equitable, and inclusive place. And so I'm really proud to be a member of this department. And Zakiya, maybe if you want to add to that, I welcome your comments too.
Yes, and sorry, I was just looking at some of the questions that people had submitted and some stuff in the chat, so I was enthralled. But actually, Caitlyn, to your last point, sorry, Katie, we have, so yeah, like this department is really unique, and I don't expect that everyone has like sat there and Googled me, but if you did, you would know that my former institution was in California, right? And people are always like, oh my gosh, how can you leave California? And you're like, well, there's multiple things. Like, this is amazing to think about the unique opportunity to help build a rebuild a sociology department, to help move forward a doctoral program, right, that is thinking very intentionally about graduate school and also thinking very intentionally about producing scholars who, yes, are doing amazing research, and also thinking about the implications of their research. And also this faculty is drawing from the experiences of people at all different types of institutions, whether it's, they're first coming in as faculty or from other types of institutions, and are really bringing in lessons learned and energy, right, to making this department like a top department. I think it's already, it's been just a few months and it's been an amazing workplace and it's been really collegial, and also people are just doing really interesting things. And it's not only about producing amazing research, it's also about thinking about, okay, how does this move beyond the pages of academic journals, for example, which, while they are important, there's many more people who are impacted by the issues we are studying than other academics.
That's actually a great segue into my next question, because I think, one of the things that's really interesting and important about the sociology department is the emphasis it places on publicly engaged scholarship, and you've both alluded to that. Can you say a little bit more about the ways in which the faculty in your department, or you yourselves, are really trying to engage more with the public in terms of the impact of your scholarship?
Zakiya, do you want to go first, or would you rather me?
I think, it might be useful to also, like in sociology, there's this concept, public sociology, which says basically like move your work outside of the academy. And I think that for some of us, right, that's been sort of an impulse of our work, particularly folks like me working in a Black feminist sociological tradition, where one, there's recognition that knowledge comes from many places, and also that knowledge should go many places. So, there's the public work of like, sure, I was on the news last week talking about, what I think the implications of the Dobbs, Supreme Court ruling. But I'm also someone who tries to bring my expertise in, when I am asked to, into different organizational spaces, which I can talk more about that sort of later, but thinking about what does it mean to be able to take, in some ways, sort of a 30,000-foot view of things when, say, in organizations, people are dealing with the very like day-to-day of like, how do you keep the doors open? How do you do this? And it can be really hard to think in the big picture. And having someone like a sociologist who is on your board or engaged otherwise can really be useful for thinking about those things. So I think there's both like the sort of smaller ways, and then there's the sort of bigger ways as well, or more sort of public ways, which I think Katie might be the perfect person to talk about this. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Zakiya. I think, we can think of public sociology as having lots of different facets. And one of those, I think that Zakiya mentioned, is developing your research questions, what you want to study, based in the questions and concerns that communities you care about have to say, right? So turning to them to ask what keeps you up at night, right? What are the issues that prevent you from leading the sort of contented and fulfilling life that you deserve, right? And I think a lot of the faculty in our department take that approach in thinking in kind of driving their research agendas. So that's one avenue I think that would speak to this issue of public scholarship. A second area is, as Zakiya just mentioned, community partnerships. And I guess one small example I can throw out there is a class that I've taught the past few years with Professor David Cunningham in the Sociology Department and Professor Patty Hayda in the Sam Fox School of Urban Design and Architecture. And the three of us designed a class to bring together students from Sam Fox, Urban Design and Architecture students, with sociology students to think about inequality specifically in the context of St. Louis, right? The city that we all live in and call home, and to understand how inequality itself manifests and is reproduced here, right, in ways that tend to exacerbate inequalities. So we bring together students from these two disciplines to think through how inequality in St. Louis is historical, how it's interpersonal, and how it's also spatial. And we do this by partnering with a local community organization called Arch City Defenders, which is a nonprofit civil rights litigation firm. And the students embark on a semester-long research project, an intensive research project, driven by a question that Arch City Defenders has raised for us. And we have asked Arch City, what is the issue, that's most pressing for your clients today, who are really some of St. Louis's most disadvantaged residents, right? And so, for example, the past year that we taught it, what they said was that electronic monitoring, and what's often referred to as e-carceration, is the issue that is sort of the next frontier in kind of the long arm of the state in intervening in really harmful ways in their clients' lives. And so this semester was spent by students digging deeply into this issue of electronic monitoring and bringing that back to Arch City to help inform the work that they do. So I'll leave it at that, but that's one arena we see public sociology playing out in the department in a way that I think is really impactful. And then the last that Zakiya mentioned is about bringing our research to more public-facing audiences through dissemination broadly, right? So I'm fortunate to say that I've written for national media outlets on this. Several of us in the department have done TED Talks. We're, in the media, on radio and talk shows and whatnot, podcasts all the time. Zakiya, I just saw a link today to a talk that you did here in St. Louis, I think on television, if I'm remembering right. And so part of what feels really cool about sociology is that this is actually encouraged in the department. That's not the case at all departments across the country, but this assumption that you are engaged in public conversations on these topics and that sociologists have something very important to add to the conversation, to me is a real strength of the department, but also is part of what makes it so fun to be here with other colleagues who also think of that as central to the work that we do.
Wonderful. Now, Dr. Collins, you already mentioned this. You talked a little bit about COVID-19 and how that impacted the research questions you were asking. But Dr. Luna, I'm curious, have you seen kind of a particular shift in any of the conversations that you are in as a function specifically of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes. So something that I was not ever planning on doing, but happened during the pandemic is I was a board co-chair of a reproductive justice organization in California. I'd started that in January, and our interim executive director left March 13th, which was the day after California began its shelter in place. So anyone who's been with a nonprofit knows that the board co-chairs become the heads of the organization. And something that was, of course, on our mind is, we had employees, and we're a reproductive justice organization that had particular values, right? And the challenge of putting your values into practice, like even when things are like great, that can be challenging in any organizational space. And what about crisis, right? And so it was really this moment of saying, okay, what does it mean to support employees? What does it mean to think about how you shift work remotely for health needs? What does it mean to develop the COVID-19 policy for employees, which again, that no one knew, that this was going to be the context in which it was happening. And having staff that, for 3 months, of course, we're asking questions. We were in the ED search, so that, but we're wondering about what about this? What's going to happen, as far as going back into the office, right? And what about, a whole set of things? What about healthcare coverage? What does this mean? And doing things in our minds that were sort of justice oriented, for example, still paying employees at full rate, even though, like we said, like you can do reduced schedule, right? But at the same time, dealing with financial realities of the fact that we had been 3 weeks away from the launch of our main fundraiser that brought in 1/3 of the organizational budget, right? And so really gives a different perspective. And I think for many organizations in the spaces I was in, for putting your values into practice when there are these moments of crisis, right? And really having to reflect on that. And what does it mean to try to stay true to your values, to try to support people while also trying to, keep the lights on and do these sorts of things, and recognizing, people have lives. And partly that was our big way of thinking, this is a reproductive justice space. If it can't happen here, where's it going to happen, right? These are folks who are committed to families being able to form. These are the folks who think healthcare is a human right, these types of things. And so I think COVID brought a lot of conversations, but also moved from conversation to very clear realities for folks in social justice spaces because it means you're dealing with a lot of unknowns while also trying to live your values. And so that, and those are continuing conversations, and particularly because the work I was doing was in reproductive spaces, that was also and continues to be a very challenging time for anyone working around reproductive health issues. And so it's really just sort of accelerated various conversations and clarified, right? What does it mean to do work that you think is important and value and to put people first?
Dr. Collins, is there anything else about the impact of COVID-19 on your work that you wanted to share? Like I said, I know you already talked about how you've very explicitly incorporated that into your research.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess one point I would make is about how this pandemic has been an impossibly difficult time for all folks, but it's been more impossible for some than others. And I do think that amidst this very dark time, one exciting possibility that I see arising is that the issue of care is now on the national agenda. It's in the national media on a daily basis. It's at the forefront of national policy conversations, the Build Back Better Act, right? Though, of course, there's heated debate around this at the moment, has a very real chance of passing several important pieces of legislation that would make a very real material difference for all families, but particularly the families who are most in need of and most deserve the support. So, vulnerable hourly wage workers, for example, like the kind Zakiya was just referring to. And so to me, amidst this immense difficulty that we're all facing, the idea that care is being discussed, who provides care, who deserves care, the answer is all of us provide care, all of us deserve care. The fact that that is part of the national conversation to me is a very exciting possibility. And, I mentioned briefly, some of the privileged moms that I've interviewed for my work talk about kind of blaming themselves. I think part of what we have seen uncovered during this difficult time is that the set of social structures in place, the sorts of federal policies in place, aren't designed to support working parents and mothers in particular, right? And people are mad. And that's a good thing. Zakiya, as a social movements expert, which is not my area of expertise, can talk about the generative power of strong emotions like anger to fuel change. And I do think that people are asking, what is it that we deserve from one another, from our communities, but also from the government by way of helping us navigate our day-to-day lives in ways that feel more just, right? And so to me, COVID-19, for all of its awfulness, has also brought about this kind of public conversation, but also the sense that perhaps we all deserve far better. And we don't have to start from scratch and envisioning what this more just, equitable, and inclusive world looks like, right? And to me, that's a very exciting set of possibilities.
Great. This is actually a nice time then to transition to some of the questions that we're getting in the Q&A and chat, because they follow up on some of the things you're bringing up. And so kind of one theme in a set of questions that I'm seeing is this question of should, like, going forward, should the solution be to really push the government to expand and take over issues of childcare, family leave, versus how much should we be pressuring, private businesses and other organizations to be expanding? What are your thoughts, that both of you, about the path forward?
Zakiya, do you want to start us off?
I mean, I feel like in some ways, as a sociologist, or maybe just me, my personality, I'm often like, it's a both and.
Yes, I was just going to say both and.
Well, also,
I had a feeling.
This comes from movement work, right? So social movements are, yes, about emotion, or about hope, and they're also about envisioning a different future, right? But social movements are a long-term process, right? And some of the things that many movements are aiming for are 40 years down the line, right? I mean, think about the right to vote for women and how long that took, and then for African American. I mean, and in the meantime, people are still living their lives, right? They still have bills to pay. They still have, healthcare that they need, and so it's really a both and. And I think, one conclusion from that could be like, oh my gosh, well then, how are we going to get anything done? I take it as well, actually, this means that there's multiple places that people can actually be engaged. right? If you are someone who is really intrigued by or excited by or thinking about, paid parental benefits in different employer spaces, then there's organizations working on that, right? That are part of larger movements that you can get involved with, right? Or you think about your own workplaces, right? And think about that, right? But if you're interested more thinking at the federal level, like there's so many organizations doing work around that, right? And so there's all these different ways to connect in around any particular issue. And that's why I also think the sort of both and approach is important, because these issues, there's not just one thing that is creating a particular problem, right? There's multiple things, therefore you need to address it from the multiple directions. That's my take.
I would add to that also that, sociology is, as we tell our students each semester, right, sociology is really interested in thinking about how inequality is produced and maintained, but also how social change happens at the level of the individual, also at the level of interactions in organizations, as well as institutions and kind of broader society. And those are mutually reinforcing and influencing, right? And so the Zakiya's point here, I think, is that we need to be trying to affect change on all of those levels, right? And rather than that feeling overwhelming, I actually think it's quite exciting, right? To think about how we need grassroots organizational change, community level change, but we also need folks to be putting pressure on our institutions and on our federal policies to take positive steps forward. And I love this point of Zakiya's, right, that we need to envision the future that we want to inhabit, right? If we want to create positive change, we have to have some goals in mind. So for example, for me, one goal would be, here in the United States, I think that parents deserve 6 months to a year of paid parental leave. That's what I'd like to see happen. Empirically, there's a lot of research that shows how beneficial that is. But we're not going to go from 0 days of paid family leave to 12 months of paid family leave. That's just not a viable political option. And so, sociologists talk about, Eric Olin, right, is a scholar whose work I've drawn on a lot, who talks about real utopias, right? We have to envision this better and more just world. But what we need are stepping stones to help us get there. He calls them accessible way stations. And one of those in my mind would be, okay, how about 12 weeks of paid family leave, right? That's gotten chopped down to 4 weeks potentially of paid family leave in the Build Back Better Act. But you know what? 4 weeks is better than 0 weeks. And 4 weeks is still a powerful symbol that the government has a role in supporting the combination of work and family life and a parent's time to spend time with a child, a newborn, adopted, or birth baby, right? And that legal symbol matters a lot in the cultural imagination about what's possible. So for me, that's one example how I think we can see kind of change from both the bottom up and the top down, and setting these kind of goals that help us get to that more just, equitable future we can envision, to me feels, again, like an exciting set of possibilities. And it's fun to engage with Zakiya about these topics together, given our overlapping interests.
Yeah, very interesting. So that kind of connects again to another kind of set of questions that we're getting about kind of what is unique about the United States and having some of these challenges, right? And so, what is kind of, how does America's methodology, as one of the questioners asked, like, how does America's approach to defining motherhood differ from other regions? Is there something, unique about that? And are there other countries or regions that we can draw lessons from that could really change how we approach things here?
Ooh, that's a big one. I mean, on the last question, like the short answer is, yeah, there's so many other models out there. I mean, one thing I think that is important to keep in mind, and why, I frame my talk in the reproductive justice perspectives and thinking about even sort of what images are out there, right? Is because, like, to the degree that any policy is sort of made, right, the sort of who is the subject of policy, right? And we know, for example, that, and someone in the chat put that they did the Google search as I suggested, and indeed lots of working mom images or laptops, right? But we know that policies aren't working well for them, right? So we know they're really bad, even for women who are in middle-class jobs, or let's just say broadly parents, right? Or upper class, C-suite jobs, right? And still, right, horrible, right? So that therefore we know low-income folks, right? This idea of work-life balance, people are like, what is there to balance? There's no, you got to work your 40, 50 hours, right? Or even more. And so one, it's sort of changing cultural conversations around like who is even included in it. And when you think about sort of how the US developed, the idea of who was a mother, well, from the very beginning, right, obviously there were some pretty big groups excluded from who was even being considered mother, particularly, for example, enslaved African women were not considered mothers, right? They were property and their children were property, right? So from the beginning, you have this sort of bifurcated system of whose parenting, whose childcare was even considered valid. And one of my mentors, Dorothy Roberts, writes about how that what didn't just have a continuing impact on policy for, say, Black women, but actually for white women, for Latinx folks, and for all families, right? Because she talks about essentially how it's a great example of the original sort of conflict, you know, about what does it mean to be a working mother, right? And that these contradictions have existed from the formation of this nation. And that is something that is, not going to say it's exclusive to the US, but that is something that impacts, right, you know, policy development and continuing so, right? So that's the sort of broader context that we're in. And then also, you know, just the way that work is conceptualized. I mean, I'll let Katie say more about this, but I mean, I think the fact is like the way work is conceptualized and the sort of live to work, right? That's a ethos in the US. And when you travel outside the US, if you get the opportunity, people are always like, what are y'all doing there? Like, what is going on there? So Katie, I'll let you talk more since you have research from folks in a range of places.
Thanks, Zakiya. Yeah, so I've been talking about this in my class, my students a lot this semester, right? You know, they're like, why is it so bad for families in the US? What is going on here? And there's nothing surprising, as Zakiya has pointed out, about how difficult it is for families in the US, in particular kinds of families, to navigate their daily lives here. This is baked into the kind of the very structures, the very institutions that define US society, right? So we talk about the United States as what we call a liberal welfare state, or even a neoliberal welfare state that suggests that citizens, residents, turn to the market to meet their needs, right? And this obsession with the market to resolve social problems means that the government does very little to intervene to help buffer citizens from market uncertainties, for example. And again, in the United States, this obsession again with work that Zakiya has pointed out overrides everything, right? Why is healthcare tied to employment in our country? Like, this makes no sense when you zoom out, for example, and think about, I don't know, what might happen in a global pandemic for folks who don't have access to healthcare through their employers, right? You know, benefits, why are these tied to employers instead of considered social rights that you have by virtue of being a living, breathing human in the United States, right? This live to work approach, as Zakiya mentioned, is really detrimental. And what it means is, in the United States, this turning to the market means that more advantaged workers, primarily white, primarily men, primarily high educated workers, can seek the sorts of benefits they want through their employers, right? What this, of course, creates is a dramatic disparity between these kinds of workers and those who can't access or advocate for those sorts of policies in their workplaces. Vulnerable hourly wage workers, as I mentioned, folks of color, low income folks, folks with lower levels of education. And as I said, it's highly advantaged folks who already have more resources at their disposal to navigate work and family difficulties. And this set of disparities means that the market is actually reproducing these inequalities that have been baked in, as Zakiya mentioned, from the get-go. And it doesn't have to be this way, right? This obsession with work as the solution to our problems and the main source of our identities just doesn't exist everywhere. So, you know, when folks in the US, as Zakiya mentioned, have the privilege of traveling elsewhere, so often Americans ask other folks the question, well, what do you do? And other folks are confused what we mean, because we really mean, what do you do for work, right? We think of that as so defining to who we are as people here in the US, which is of course a privileged thing to have your work help define who you are as a person. But folks elsewhere find that really weird and like sad and lame of Americans, right? What do you do elsewhere is not the first question you ask, or it has to do with a much broader set of interests other than just your job, right? Work doesn't have to define us, and we can decenter its importance, but this requires taking on some of the most powerful social structures and economic systems in the United States, capitalism, for example. But again, other countries do this. Other countries have welfare states that intervene in the market to protect citizens. And so this set of inequalities is not inevitable. I think that's the point Zakiya made and what I want to reinforce.
We also have had the question, just the very practical question of whether there are organizations in St. Louis, if community members wanted to get involved in that would allow them to advocate for parental benefits. Are there social justice organizations in St. Louis that do that?
So I'll answer that and semi-answer a question that someone else asked. And I would say, well, one place to think about is your workplace.
I was going to ask that next.
Yep, it's your own workplace. And actually, I thought about starting off my talk with a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt about sort of human rights are the things that, need to be protected at home, not as in like just the places that are big on maps, but like these small spaces. And when you think about how much time people spend at work, it's really important, right? For it to be a space that helps support workers, not just as workers, but as people. And in part because the data shows like that actually then makes people, happier and they're more productive and there's less turnover and things like that, that employers tend to care about. And so I'd say, one place is looking at your own workplace, right? Now, some of you might be in places that have 5 employees. Some people might be in places that have 500 employees. But part of that, when I teach a class on reproduction, I say to students, I don't think that you're necessarily going to remember every single, year in factoid from this, but something I want you to think about is, when you take a job, like at least, look at what the benefits are going to be or not. And that might be really important to you, right? Because if you're going to be at a place for 3, 4, 5, 10 years, like a lot's going to happen in that time. And so thinking about whether it's workplace committees or, folks who are part of unions, like there's a whole other set of things that you can do in those settings. And so that's one example is starting from home and then thinking more broadly about, often it's the case that organizations that focus on quote unquote women's issues are more likely to be doing work on paid leave, even though like it affects everybody, as someone pointed out in some of the chat. So whether it's organizations like 9 to 5 or things like that to be thinking about, and their sort of local, sort of regional chapters can be really useful. Yeah.
And I'll say also to add to that, the organization that came immediately to mind dovetails on this point Zakiya just made, that issues that revolve around supporting parents tend to fall into organizations that support women, right? Even though these are issues that affect all parents, not just women. An organization that comes to mind for me is the Women's Foundation of St. Louis, which is doing work on issues like paid family leave, but also stuff like pay equity and others that I admire a lot here in the area. So there's the name of one local organization I encourage you to look up. Art City Defenders is another one here in town that helps, as I mentioned, kind of the most marginalized in our communities, get out of things like electronic monitoring or out of the workhouse here in town and reconnect and be at home with their families in ways that I think are human rights, as Zakiya mentioned.
So interesting. So maybe we're getting close to the end of our time. Maybe I'll ask one last follow-up question from the chat and I'll kind of maybe combine it a bit. So one of the attendees asked about, how do you think about the connection between being a sociologist and activism, right? Like, what does that mean for you? And how much have you thought about that in the context of your own workplace, WashU?
Okay, I mean, yeah, I saw that question there. I right now in sociology broadly as a discipline, there's a lot of discussion about this. And as a social movement scholar, I will tell you, there's actually studies on the folks, many folks say, oh, I don't identify as an activist. I just do these 10 things in my daily life, like advocate, do that, but I'm not an activist, right? So I think it's important, like, one, to think about, the work you do in the day-to-day, right? Like you don't necessarily have to identify as an activist, right, to make change. And I think about it in sort of different avenues. There's the work I've been doing, sort of internal movement education, and then there's things, that in my spare time, my non-work time, for example, when I mentioned having worked on a board, that was volunteer hours, and that was me using the flexibility of my job to support an organization I believed in, that I'd had some different interactions with, and was going through a transition period and needed some folks who had the flexibility with their workspace and jobs to take that on and bring that expertise, right? But I also, do work with organizations that, whether it's through donating or helping people get rides to healthcare, I think there's all sorts of things that actually many of us might take for granted that we have, that we can actually help other people as far as a resource. So I think it doesn't have to be some big, huge thing. And teaching social movements in winter, and then we talk about that, common image of activism is people out protesting. And that is certainly one thing, but I'm always like, what it takes for a protest to happen? Like, there's meetings, there's meals that those people at the meetings need. There's childcare if you want families to be able to participate in meetings. Actually, providing childcare at meetings can be really instrumental, right? There's all these different ways that actually people can support different efforts, and that's what movements are. Individuals coming together, doing all sorts of things that bring together and make a big change. So that's how I've thought about it. And as far as WashU, I'm still getting settled in. So we'll see. But I am teaching social movements in winter, and I'll teach women's movements in next fall, I think. So I also sort of help students think about the sort of local context in that work.
Great. Dr. Collins, any last thoughts from you?
Yeah, I guess just briefly to add to that, Zakiya, thank you. I echo all of that. And you mentioned teaching at the end. I think of teaching as a central avenue for affecting positive social change as a scholar, an academic, as an anti-racist feminist who cares about these issues, and the classroom introducing students to the social construction of inequality, and thinking about not only how inequality is created, but also maintained and reproduced. To me, helping students understand these mechanisms of inequality, to think about, so many of my students, for example, haven't spent any time thinking about what it may be like one day if they decide to have children, to combine working and having kids. Putting that on the agenda for them, getting them thinking about it now, as Zakiya mentioned, thinking about the sorts of employers they will be seeking out, to me is one, promising avenue forward, getting these students thinking about how their own social location shapes the barriers and opportunities they face themselves, but also thinking through the kind of these intersections of privilege and oppression in their own lives, and how they might affect positive change themselves as students from, graduating from an elite university, are going to be well poised to make change themselves. And I think the sociology department in general, in all of our classes, is working to help students understand these mechanisms of inequality, but also how they can connect to resolutions to these social problems as well. So that's one kind of small example of how I see sociology playing a role in kind of creating the positive change we want to see.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Luna and Dr. Collins, I think these talks and this discussion sort of really illustrates the richness that sociology and your scholarship is bringing to the Washington University community, and hopefully engaging with and having a positive impact on our local St. Louis community, as well as, national and global issues that are highly relevant. We've reached the end of our time today. I want to thank you so much for your interesting presentations and discussion. I want to thank everybody who joined us to celebrate the power of arts and sciences through this event and all week. As I mentioned at the start of this, the new strategic plan for arts and sciences was just made public, and I will shout out that publicly engaged scholarship that focuses on creating a diverse, equitable, and just environment is a major part of that strategic plan. And so we'd like to share a video that celebrates our new vision for arts and sciences, and a link to the strategic plan website is also in the chat for those who are interested. Thank you again for your time and attention, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Our campus sits near the confluence of two ancient rivers. Ecosystems merge and thrive in our midst. Our region has seen diverse cultures take root, fight for survival, and reach toward greatness. A host of resources, historical and cultural, innovative and intellectual, enrich our work. They draw us to engage with our city, with each other, and with communities around the globe. Our school, Arts and Sciences, represents a convergence of ideas that shape our understanding of the world, and indeed the world itself. We will elevate scholarship that is creative and ambitious by embracing new ideas, emerging technologies, and shifting paradigms. We will honor and promote the pursuit and discovery of knowledge. We will seek distinction in cutting-edge scholarship and push boundaries both within and among disciplines to meet the most critical challenges facing our communities and our planet. We will find new ways to tell our story, to share the matter and meaning behind our work. We are an institution devoted to bringing people together to serve the public good. Our partnerships here in St. Louis and across the region will identify shared goals, and we will pursue academic and educational excellence that positively impacts our communities.
We will forge critical connections
From the local to the global,
expanding solutions.
and imparting lasting impacts on the world.
within our own community.
Faculty, staff, and students
of all identities will feel valued,
represented, and equally empowered to pursue their goals.
Here, we will create
meaningful connections
with our peers,
our mentors,
and the St. Louis community.
We will gather knowledge
and learn how to apply it
to build lives
filled with meaning and purpose.
We will go out into the world
as engaged,
active,
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 active, and impactful members of our communities.
Together, our voices will rise to shape the next decade and all the decades to come. We are ready. The time is now. Welcome to the Decade of Arts and Sciences.